December 7, 1941. Pearl Harbor burns, and within 72 hours, the United States military faces a logistics nightmare that has nothing to do with battleships or aircraft. Across the Pacific theater, from the Philippines to Wake Island, American forces are sleeping in canvas tents that disintegrate under tropical downpours within 3 weeks. The War Department's morning briefings turned grim when field reports arrived describing entire supply depots flooded, ammunition ruined, and soldiers hospitalized with pneumonia because their shelter literally fell apart during monsoon season. Traditional wooden barracks require skilled carpenters, weeks of construction time, and lumber that simply doesn't exist on remote coral atolls. The Navy calculates it would take 18 months to build conventional housing for the forces they need to deploy immediately. In Washington, Brigadier General Eugene Raybould stands before a crisis table covered in weather maps and construction timelines. His engineers present the impossible equation. They need structures that can be manufactured in Pennsylvania, shipped 10,000 meters through submarine-infested waters, assembled by exhausted Marines who've never held a wrench, and survive everything the Pacific can throw at them. 130-degree heat, Category 5 typhoons, monsoons that dump 15 inches of rain in 6 hours, and the very real possibility of Japanese bombing runs. The standard Army tent costs $12 but lasts 1 month in jungle conditions. A wooden barracks building costs $8,000 and requires a construction crew for 6 weeks. Neither option works when you're island hopping across the Pacific and need shelter for 50,000 men yesterday. The British have been fighting longer, and their experience in North Africa offers a clue. Since 1916, they've used Nissan huts, semi-circular steel shelters invented by Canadian engineer Peter Neeson during World War I. These corrugated iron half-cylinders house 30 soldiers, require no skilled labor to erect, and laugh at sandstorms. But the Neeson design has critical flaws for Pacific deployment. The British version uses heavy steel panels that need specialized lifting equipment. The ventilation system works for the Libyan desert, but turns the interior into a steam cooker in Philippine humidity. Most damaging, each hut requires custom foundation work, which means pouring concrete or building wooden platforms, which brings you right back to the carpenter problem. Raybould's team calculates they need shelter for 2 million personnel across hundreds of islands and bases. The math is brutal. At conventional construction rates, the war would be over before half the troops had roofs. Soldiers are already writing letters home, describing how they wake up with their boots full of rainwater, how fungus grows on their uniforms overnight, how the temporary tents collapse during storms and send men scrambling in the mud at 0300 hours. The Medical Corps reports that respiratory infections are hospitalizing more men than enemy action in some sectors. This isn't just about comfort, it's about maintaining a fighting force that doesn't rot away before seeing combat. The call goes out to American engineering firms, university research departments, and the Navy's own construction battalions. The specifications sound like science fiction. Design a building that weighs less than a Jeep, fits on a single rail car, requires no foundation, assembles in 1 day with basic tools, costs less than $1,000, and survives conditions that destroy permanent buildings. Oh, and have 10,000 units ready to ship in 6 months. It's February 1942, and somewhere in Rhode Island, a team of engineers is about to turn architectural impossibility into reality. The Neeson hut blueprint arrives at the Navy's Bureau of Yards and Docks in a peculiar twist of wartime cooperation. British engineers, grateful for American supply shipments, share detailed technical drawings of their World War I shelter design, 16 feet wide semi-circular tunnels made from corrugated iron sheets bolted to a wooden frame. Commander John Philip Drosfeld studies the specifications and immediately sees both genius and problems. The genius. The arch shape naturally deflects wind and sheds water without complex engineering. The problems. A laundry list that would doom the design in Pacific conditions. The British huts weigh 3 tons when disassembled, require foundation bolts drilled into concrete, and use an internal wooden frame that becomes a feast for termites in tropical climates. Drosfeld circles the ventilation specs in red ink. Two small windows designed for Scottish weather would turn these things into ovens at Guadalcanal's 98-degree average temperature. But there is another American voice in this conversation, and it comes from an unexpected corner. Buckminster Fuller has been preaching prefabricated housing since the 1920s, though most architects dismiss him as a crank. His Dymaxion house concept, factory-built, lightweight, assembled on site, reads, "And you waste interior headroom and create difficult end-wall geometry." Brandenburger's team settles on an 8-foot radius, a perfect semicircle that provides 7-foot headroom at the sides and creates what structural engineers call a self-racing arch. The corrugated steel naturally wants to hold this curve, which means the panels can be thinner and lighter than flat sheets would require for the same strength. They run load calculations showing this design can theoretically handle snow loads up to 40 pounds per square foot and wind speeds exceeding 100 miles per hour. But theoretical calculations and Pacific typhoons are different animals. By day 40, they have something that looks like it might work. A Frankenstein's monster of riveted panels, experimental joints, and borrowed hardware. The first complete prototype goes up on May 25, 1942. Assembled by 6 sailors who've been given 4 hours of instruction and basic hand tools. The assembly time, 14 hours, which is encouraging, but not yet good enough. The Navy wants single-day construction capability because marine landing schedules don't allow for multi-day building projects. The team identifies the bottleneck immediately, the floor system. They've been trying to include a wooden floor as part of the package, but it's the slowest part to assemble and the first thing to rot in tropical conditions anyway. The solution is elegant in its simplicity. Eliminate the floor entirely from the basic design. The hut sits directly on whatever surface exists: coral, sand, dirt, or if you're lucky, gravel. For applications requiring finished floors, those can be added later as a separate project, but the basic shelter achieves weather protection without them. This single decision cuts assembly time to 8 hours and reduces shipping weight by 1,200 pounds per unit. On June 10, 1942, the final prototype stands complete: 96 corrugated steel panels, each weighing less than 50 pounds, that bolt together to create 720 square feet of enclosed space. Total materials cost $1,394 total, weight 9,000 pounds. The real test begins when the Quonset prototype faces the engineering equivalent of an interrogation. Navy structural engineers arrive with wind load tables, typhoon data from meteorological stations across the Pacific, and a healthy skepticism that this corrugated tunnel can survive what nature throws at tropical islands. The numbers they're working with aren't theoretical. They're pulled from actual weather events. Typhoon Gloria hit Guam in November 1940 with sustained winds of 140 miles per hour and gusts reaching 180. The 1935 Labor Day hurricane that killed 400 people in the Florida Keys produced winds so powerful they sandblasted paint off buildings and drove wooden planks through palm trees like spears. If Quonset huts fail in a storm, the result isn't just property damage. It's dead servicemen and destroyed equipment. Brandenburger's team starts with the fundamental physics of why the arch shape works. When wind hits a flat wall, it creates what engineers call a pressure coefficient. The wind pushes I-beam, resisting bending forces that would crumple smooth sheet metal. The math gets fascinating when you examine how loads distribute through the arch. In a conventional rectangular building, the roof pushes down on walls, the walls push down on foundations, and everything depends on those vertical load paths staying intact. Storm winds can literally lift roofs off because they're separate elements just sitting on top of walls. The Quonset arch changes this completely. It's a single continuous curve where every panel shares the load with its neighbors. Engineers call this a compression ring, and it's the same principle that keeps stone bridges standing for centuries without mortar. The hoop stress, the tension trying to spread the arch apart at its base, gets resolved by the ground itself. Each Quonset panel is bolted to the adjacent panel with 3/4-inch steel bolts spaced every 6 inches, creating what's essentially a 48-foot-long steel cable wrapped in an arch shape. But theoretical strength means nothing without testing. So the Navy sets up validation experiments that border on sadistic. They build a full-scale Quonset at Davisville, Rhode Island, and instrument it with strain gauges, pressure sensors, and deflection meters. Then they wait for the first major nor'easter. On March 3, 1943, a storm hits with 75-mile-per-hour winds and heavy snow loading. Perfect test conditions. The instruments record the structure flexing by less than 2 inches at the crown, then returning to its original shape when the wind subsides. The panel joints hold, nothing leaks. The structure behaves exactly as the calculations predicted, which is both thrilling and slightly terrifying because it means they're about to bet thousands of lives on this design. The tropical environment testing proves more challenging than wind loads. You can't simulate years of jungle conditions in a Rhode Island warehouse. So, like prophecy, in 1942, Fuller's ideas about mass-reducing housing like automobiles using industrial materials instead of traditional lumber and designing for rapid deployment all sound less crazy when your country needs to build an entire city's worth of shelter every month. The military hasn't directly consulted Fuller, but his published papers circulate through engineering departments, and his core insight proves invaluable. Treat buildings like manufactured products, not construction projects. The Navy consolidates this thinking at their facility in Quonset Point, Rhode Island, a freshly commissioned air station on Narragansett Bay. The location isn't random. Rhode Island has deep manufacturing expertise in sheet metal from its jewelry and silverware industries, plus proximity to steel mills in Pennsylvania, and shipyards that understand marine-grade corrosion resistance. In March 1942, the Navy assembles an unusual team, structural engineers from the Strand Steel Corporation, who've been building prefab farm buildings, architects from George A. Fuller Construction Company, who specialize in rapid assembly methods, and Navy officers who've actually served in the Pacific and know what typhoon-proof really means versus what it means on paper. The team lead, Otto Brandenberger, brings farm building experience that turns out to be exactly right for this problem. His strand steel barns use self-supporting arch panels, no internal frame needed, which means no wood for termites to eat and no complex joinery to fail during storms. Brandenberger's radical proposal: eliminate the Nissen hut's wooden skeleton entirely and make the corrugated steel skin carry all the loads. This violates conventional architectural wisdom in 1942, where steel is for bridges and skyscrapers, not self-supporting buildings. But Brandenberger knows his barns have survived Midwest tornadoes without internal framing, and he's willing to bet the same principle scales up. The British contribute another crucial element through their painful experience. Their Nissan huts in Burma and Singapore have taught them exactly how tropical environments destroy buildings. Fungus isn't just cosmetic. It literally eats through wood preservatives and paint within months. Humidity doesn't just make things damp. It corrodes metal fasteners until roofs collapse. Insects aren't merely annoying. Carpenter ants can reduce wooden support beams to hollow shells in one season. The British reports read like horror stories, but they provide the Quonset team with a checklist of everything that must be engineered out of the design from day one. No wood in contact with ground. All steel, hot dip, galvanized, not just painted. Ventilation aggressive enough to prevent condensation. Every fastener accessible for replacement without disassembling the structure. By April 1942, the hybrid vision crystallizes. Take the Nissan hut's brilliant arch geometry, strip out everything that makes it heavy or vulnerable, add Fuller's mass production philosophy and American steel manufacturing muscle, then engineer every detail for the specific hell of Pacific Island warfare. April 15, 1942. Otto Brandenberger walks into a Quonset Point warehouse with 30 engineers and a deadline that would be laughable if the war situation weren't so desperate. 60 days to design, prototype, test, and approve a completely new building system that doesn't yet exist. The team works in shifts around the clock, sleeping on cots pushed against the warehouse walls, subsisting on Navy Masal coffee, and the kind of pressure that either produces brilliance or complete collapse. Brandenberger divides his crew into specialist teams. One group tackles aerodynamics and structural loading. Another figures out how to nest components for shipping. A third works exclusively on the joint and fastener problem that plagued the British design. The first radical decision happens on day 3. Traditional architectural drawings take weeks to produce, and the team doesn't have weeks. Instead, they build in real time, sketch a detail in the morning, have the metal working shop fabricate it by afternoon, test it overnight, and revise by dawn. This iterative prototyping approach is standard in 2025, but revolutionary in 1942 when buildings are designed completely on paper before a single piece is cut. The warehouse floor becomes a laboratory scattered with failed joint experiments, bent test panels, and increasingly refined versions of each component. The engineers steal a technique from aircraft manufacturing. Every part gets a number. Every revision gets documented, and nothing moves to the next prototype generation without solving the previous version's failure points. The dimensions come from brutal practicality rather than aesthetic choice. 16 feet wide, the maximum that fits on a standard rail car without special permits, 20 feet long per section, short enough that 4 men can lift a panel, but long enough to create usable,